Right, so it says a lot about Israel's idea of security that what it now fears most are doctors and journalists in dinghies, eh? Every few months, two in the last month in fact, another convoy of civilians sets out to deliver food and medicine to Gaza. Flotillas of vessels carrying aid and human decency. Every time Israel scrambles its navy as if the fate of the world depending on stopping a few boxes of paracetamol. The Freedom Flotilla Coalition's latest mission, in the immediate aftermath of the much larger Sumud Flotilla, was no different. 9 boats, 93 passengers, and one superpower-backed military sent to intercept them, once again committing piracy in international waters to do so. You would think a country that claims so much moral authority might feel a little bit embarrassed by this spectacle on repeat by now, but Israel calls it law enforcement, don't they? And if its allies just nod along as if international law wasn't actually being repeatedly trampled and there's nothing they could possibly do to stop them, well, it's the same story every time, isn't it? A government terrified not of weapons, but of witnesses. Right, so in the wee small hours of this morning, Israeli naval forces intercepted the latest aid flotilla aiming to break the siege of Gaza, a convoy of 9 civilian vessels in the eastern Mediterranean. The ships were organised by the Freedom Flotilla Coalition and the Thousand Madeleines to Gaza campaign, and their stated objective was to deliver humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip and to challenge Israel's maritime blockade, just as every flotilla before them has done. According to information released by the organisers, the flotilla carried 93 passengers from various countries, including journalists, doctors, elected officials, civil society representatives. The lead ship, the Conscience, the same vessel struck back in March just off the coast of Malta, transported more than 110,000 US dollars worth of medical and nutritional supplies, including medicines, respiratory devices, and fortified food for hospitals there. The convoy was sailing roughly 120 nautical miles from Gaza, well outside Israel's territorial waters, when it was surrounded by Israeli naval vessels and ordered to stop. The organisers state that the ships were boarded and seized by armed personnel, and that communications with the flotilla were severed shortly afterwards. All things we've come to expect from Israel in response to attempts to bust their 18-year-long blockade of the Strip. Israel confirmed the operation and described it as an enforcement action under what it calls a legal naval blockade of Gaza, and all passengers were taken back to port, no doubt to await much of the same mistreatment we've heard about from recently released Sumud Flotilla crew members before their eventual deportation. Israel's blockade of Gaza was, of course, introduced back in 2007 following the election to power of Hamas in the Strip. Israel argues that the measure is a legitimate security response intended to prevent weapons smuggling and attacks on Israeli territory, but really it was an exercise in democracy that they didn't like the result of. They preferred their patsies and the Palestinian Authority to be in charge, and frankly so did the PA. Mahmoud Abbas refused to cede power, having lost that election, and has remained leader in the West Bank ever since, and having not held a single election since, despite him effectively losing power some 20 years ago nearly. Human rights organisations and UN bodies have long disputed the legality of the Israeli blockade. Their central argument is that the blockade imposes indiscriminate restrictions on 2 million civilians, amounting to collective punishment prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the last 2 years of genocide has certainly shone a light on that like never before. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, coastal states do not have general jurisdiction to detain foreign civilian vessels taken in international waters, yet Israel has got away with doing so repeatedly now. Limited exceptions exist for acts such as piracy or slave trading or unauthorized broadcasting, but Israel are the ones literally committing the piracy here. Interception is otherwise lawful only when authorized by the UN Security Council or the flag state of the said vessel. These conditions have never applied to any flotilla mission. The humanitarian context in Gaza remains critical as well. Long-term import restrictions, military operations, not to mention the last 2 years of genocide, have damaged infrastructure, limited fuel supply, and restricted access to medical equipment. Hospitals report chronic shortages of essential medicines, if they themselves are still standing, of course. And international agencies describe widespread food insecurity as Israel weaponizes starvation. Against that background, humanitarian organisations continue to send convoys by land and sea in an attempt to deliver supplies directly. Eyewitness accounts from passengers describe Israeli naval vessels approaching the flotilla before dawn. Boarding teams used ladders and small craft to seize control of the ships. The flotilla's communication links were cut shortly after the approach. All 9 vessels were then taken to Israel. Governments in Europe and the Middle East confirmed that their nationals were amongst the detainees and requested information from Israeli authorities about them. The cargo was confiscated, all $110,000 worth of it. That will all now be denied to Gaza. Israel describes these as enforceable actions under the law of naval warfare. Organisers and independent legal experts describe them as blatant violations of maritime law and humanitarian obligations, and quite frankly, the law does seem to be on their side when you read up on such things. But from a legal perspective, the key issue has always been one of jurisdiction. The flotilla was sailing in international waters when intercepted. Under customary international law, states cannot extend their domestic enforcement powers to the high seas, except in the defined cases, as I've already mentioned. Israel's claim that the blockade justifies such actions is disputed because the blockade itself is not universally recognised as lawful. The law of naval warfare, as codified in the San Remo manual, allows blockades during armed conflict under very specific conditions. They must be declared, they must be effective, they must be non-discriminatory, and they must not cause excessive harm to civilians. And Israel's blockade fails all of these conditions, particularly the prohibition on starving civilian populations as a method of warfare. It would be a brave and stupid lawyer, frankly, to try and defend this in a court of law. In practical terms, Israel's enforcement actions extend its control well beyond its territorial waters, though, because who's stopping them? Boarding civilian aid ships more than 100 nautical miles from its coast effectively asserts authority across a massive portion of the Mediterranean Sea, and yet nobody says or does anything about it. What nation states have actually taken measures to prevent it? The interception drew immediate but limited diplomatic reaction, which is what we always seem to just get. Governments whose citizens were aboard the flotilla requested access to detainees and called for their release. Some described the incident as an infringement of international law, while others confined their responses to general calls for restraint. No government initiated legal proceedings or imposed sanctions. So where is the deterrent to Israel committing acts of piracy, as they keep on doing, against civilian flotilla missions? Turkey, Malaysia, other states condemned the operation outright, describing it as piracy and an unlawful use of force against civilians. Well, please, begin legal proceedings over that then. Otherwise, it's just words, it's just oxygen being wasted. European governments issued routine statements of concern, but avoided direct criticism. The United Nations noted the incident again, but took no further action except to Chinese burn another layer of skin off their wrists. This pattern of limited diplomatic engagement has followed every flotilla interception since 2010. The absence of legal follow-up every single time indicates that political considerations continue to outweigh concerns about legality. Information about the October operation reached the public through footage and statements released by the organisers and passengers before communication was cut. Knowing what was coming, they prepared for it in advance. Photographs and short video clips circulated online showing naval vessels approaching the convoy. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is central to the flotilla campaign. Organisers argue that direct delivery by sea is necessary because land crossings are frequently closed or heavily restricted, as we know them to be. And although no major flotilla has succeeded in reaching Gaza yet, each mission draws attention to the continuing blockade and its consequences. This latest flotilla, like those before it, carried both material aid and symbolic significance. For residents of Gaza, awareness that international volunteers continue to attempt such missions is interpreted as a sign of continued solidarity, and absolutely, I would agree with that. The supplies themselves are small compared to Gaza's needs, but the visibility of the effort serves as a reminder that the blockade remains contested. For Israel, the flotillas are viewed as political challenges intended to undermine its blockade policy and international standing, as if they aren't doing that enough themselves. The state's consistent response of interception, of detention and deportation reflects a strategic calculation that allowing even one convoy to reach Gaza would create a precedent they wouldn't be able to reverse. From a security perspective, the blockade remains central to Israel's policy towards Gaza. Allowing foreign vessels to reach the territory would weaken the state's claim that it controls maritime access and would invite further attempts, but they're going to come anyway. However, repeated interceptions also generate reputational damage. Each incident reinforces the perception that Israel enforces its blockade through actions that conflict with international norms. Humanitarian groups and legal scholars cite the raids as evidence of systematic violations of international law. Over time, this accumulation of incidents forms a public record that undermines Israel's claim to act strictly within legal boundaries, when clearly and obviously they are not. The state's dilemma, therefore, is a structural one. If it refrains from enforcement, it concedes that the blockade is not absolute. If it enforces it, it exposes itself to accusations of illegality. So the contradiction can't be easily resolved without a fundamental policy change or international adjudication. Participants increasingly describe their work as civilian enforcement of international law. The logic is pretty straightforward, though. If governments will not act to uphold humanitarian principles, citizens will attempt to do it themselves through, well, what the measures we're seeing now, isn't it? Through direct, non-violent means, through these flotillas. And the more frequently these operations occur, the more they highlight the divide between legal principle and political practice. Control of information has become a defining feature of the flotilla conflict. Israel seeks to prevent live broadcasting from the ships, citing security concerns. Organisers attempt to maintain constant data transmission to document any use of force, evidence everything. The struggle over communications is therefore also a struggle over narrative control. And despite Israel's technological advantages, and its military advantages certainly, total information control is no longer possible. Video evidence from past raids remains archived and accessible, contributing to the gradual erosion of official narratives. This latest operation was smaller and generated less footage than previous missions, but still reinforced the perception that Israel responds to civilian activism with military methods. Under humanitarian law, warring parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. Denying such relief without military necessity is unlawful. Therefore, everything Israel is doing versus these flotillas is unlawful. The repeated interception of clearly identified aid ships, even if justified by security arguments, challenges the credibility of Israel's adherence to this principle. No international tribunal has yet ruled directly on the Gaza blockade's legality or on individual flotilla incidents, which is absolutely shameless given how long it's been going on. However, documentation from these missions still contributes to a growing body of evidence that will be used by human rights organisations and legal experts in broader investigations into Israeli conduct. Whether this evidence will ever result in prosecutions or formal findings, though, well, who knows? But the recurring cycle of interception and diplomatic inaction reveals the limits of international governance. Each incident is treated as a political issue rather than a legal one. States express concern but avoid steps that might impose consequences because, God forbid, Israel face any. Over time, this selective enforcement weakens the authority of international law itself, though. For Israel, the absence of enforcement acts as a de facto endorsement of its blockade policy. For humanitarian actors, it confirms that political power rather than legal obligation determines state behaviour. The flotilla movement's persistence can be seen as an attempt to counter that dynamic through continuous documentation and public exposure. Gaza's civilian population continues to experience severe humanitarian deprivation. So in this context, the humanitarian shipments carried by the flotillas, small in scale, yes, but very significant in principle. They illustrate the gap between what international law requires and what political realities are permitting. Therefore, each interception keeps that contradiction visible. So if you've been asking yourself, what is the point of all of these voyages, all of these ships, all these flotillas, if Israel is always going to stop them and nobody is going to stop Israel? Well, this is it. You see, it shames those who do nothing while keeping the plight of Gaza through the blockade and through the starvation of its people in our minds, in people around the world's heads. To give the entrenched positions on both sides, similar incidents are expected to continue then. Israel is unlikely to alter its enforcement policy. Why would they? There's no pressure on them to do so without state intervention. And the Freedom Flotilla Coalition and its partners will launch future missions. Without a negotiated end to the blockade or international law ruling on clarifying its legality or its illegality, as it really should come up with, the confrontation is just going to persist as a recurring feature of the regional conflict. Each new mission will generate additional documentation. There will be more diplomatic statements. There will be more public debate. The cumulative effect will be to maintain scrutiny of the blockade, though, as it must be kept under, and to record its enforcement methods in detail. Its latest interception demonstrates the persistence of a situation that is both politically unresolved and legally ambiguous. It confirms that humanitarian activists remain willing to test the blockade, that Israel remains determined to prevent any breach, and that the international community remains reluctant to intervene decisively in any legal manner. From a factual standpoint, the flotilla did not reach Gaza, the aid was confiscated, and the passengers have been detained and are likely to be deported in time. From a legal standpoint, questions about jurisdiction, proportionality, and humanitarian obligation, because no ruling has happened, remain open and in public discourse. Though, in our heads, I'm sure it's a pretty obvious conclusion we can all draw. From a political standpoint, the operation reinforced existing narratives on both sides rather than changing. So the longer-term consequence is cumulative. Every interception adds another example of extraterritorial enforcement and another record of how humanitarian law is applied or ignored in practice. So this latest incident fits a pattern that has persisted for over 15 years now. Civilian groups continue to test Israel's maritime control through humanitarian voyages. Israel continues to treat those voyages as security threats and enforces its blockade through military means. International institutions issue statements but impose no penalties. And this repetitive cycle sustains itself because the legal and political incentives remain unchanged. For Israel, enforcement maintains the appearance of control. For humanitarian actors, sailing demonstrates that the blockade remains a contested and controversial policy, and the more attention we draw to it, the more people will come to understand this. Until the blockade's legality is finally challenged in a court of law and acted against by state powers, as surely any such ruling coming out of that would necessitate, the pattern is going to continue. Each new interception will add to a growing historical and evidentiary record, as well as pressure on those states and their leaders who continue to ignore it. The flotilla may not reach Gaza, the next one may not reach Gaza, nor the one after that possibly, but they ensure that the question of Gaza's isolation remains visible and documented and impossible to ignore. So bring on the next one. For more on what those taking part in the last flotilla, the Sumud Flotilla, have been put through by Israel, do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.